Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I am your host, Brian Scott. Today, I'm dedicating another episode to psychometry. We have addressed psychometry in a previous episode. I want to talk about it more and offer a short meditation that you can use to amplify this ability in your life. As we enter into a fourth density Earth, your psychic abilities will manifest in greater proportions on a daily basis. The fourth density light that is now available to you, that you begin to access in meditation, that naturally becomes a part of your daily life, will manifest itself in psychic abilities. You may notice you're more empathic, for instance. You may notice that you understand what people are feeling and thinking a little bit more than you might have in the past. You might actually hear others' thoughts and have precognitive impressions of the future. One powerful way to access these psychic abilities is through psychometry. And this may happen accidentally for people all the time, but I want you to understand what it is. And then, understanding this, you can start to use it to your benefit. Essentially, psychometry is the tactile contact that ignites a flood of psychic impressions about an object, its history, or its owners. You might touch a dinosaur bone and see the dinosaur walking around millions of years ago. You might touch an old dress and see the person wearing it and what was going on in their mind. Psychometry was discovered, so to speak, by an Ohio physician, J. Rhodes Buchanan, who published his findings in 1849. Buchanan found that certain subjects could identify different medicines which were hidden in sealed envelopes. Later, he was amazed to discover that these same subjects, when given letters written by people they had never known, could accurately describe the writers, better than their most intimate friends. If psychometrists could zero in on the present, could they not use their psi ability to fathom the mysteries of the past as well? This was a question that kept tapping at Buchanan's mind. However, it was a geologist, Dr. William Denton, a contemporary of Buchanan, who actually sought to prove the theory. Denton's wife was a gifted psychometrist, and experiments were conducted with her using various objects from geological history. One object, a prehistoric relic, excited in Mrs. Denton's visions of monstrous beasts roaming the world. A relic from Pompeii evoked a dramatic and accurate description of the destruction of that ancient city. As these brief examples portray, the psychic impressions were usually visual. As Denton records, he gave the psychic a fossil fish bone from the Devonian period. Immediately upon handling it, she began to recite a vivid scene. I see clouds of steam rising from the side of a hill, and on one side a large ledge of blue rocks. I now see something long and dark that looks like a fish. There seems to be a large bump and bunch near the head. I should think it is 10 or 12 feet long. As Denton adds, the medium had no knowledge as to what the object was. Even had the psychic been somehow able to determine either consciously or subconsciously the nature of this object, the following test eliminates any normal explanation entirely. Denton allowed the psychic to touch a square of mosaic from ancient Rome, and although the subject was allowed to handle the object, she was not allowed to see it. Nonetheless, immediately upon touching it, she said, "I am in a very large building. Directly in front of me is a large circular structure, built as if it were a fountain in there or a bath of water. It is quite high and round. I see the structure which contains the water is either square or nearly so, and has a circular basin in the center with a beautiful ornamented rim. It must be a bath. What skillfully artists they must have had to cut stone statues as they did." Denton was a more cautious experimenter than Buchanan, and blindfolded his wife before each test. This was to allow her to relax and let free images develop before her eyes. She would catch hold of these images and report them to her husband. It is interesting that close to 100 years later, Rhea White, while a research associate at the American Society for Psychical Research, analyzed the manner in which famous ESP subjects condition themselves to receive psychic impressions, and found that they usually entered a stage of relaxation followed by an attempt to allow images to form in the mind. Reading Rhea White's research today shows that their descriptions closely match that of Mrs. Denton's recorded 60 years before the birth of an organized parapsychology. Two parapsychologists have made the greatest contributions to the study of psychometry have been Gustav Pagenstecker, a German doctor living in Mexico, and the French physician Eugene Osti. Pagenstecker and his research was carried out during the late 1910s and early 20s and focused on a single subject. Senora Maria Reyes de Zerold, Mrs. Zerold, was a patient of Pagenstecker who was treating with hypnosis. During one session, Mrs. Zerold had the spontaneous impression that her daughter was eavesdropping in the next room. Pagenstecker found this to be true and for the following months diligently attempted to discover the limits and capabilities of his subject's psychic abilities. Pagenstecker began by conditioning Mrs. Zerold by hypnosis to control her mental images, and finally, after weeks of work, she was able to visualize parts of the room, Pagenstecker and her surroundings, whether or not she was blindfolded. After this conditioning was complete, Pagenstecker began a Herculean project of psi testing. At first, several medical colleagues were invited to witness these experiments, and during one of these first experiments, Mrs. Zerold, who always worked while hypnotized, was given various pieces of pumice. She successfully described odors of certain pieces that had been immersed in chemicals, heard a clicking sound from one that had been left in a clock, and felt heat emanating from one rock that had in fact been specifically warmed several days before. Walter Franklin Prince, an able American psychical researcher, was the next one to test Mrs. Zerold. Traveling from New York to Mexico, Prince brought with him slips of paper containing messages from many different people. Hoping that Mrs. Zerold could give veridical information about the writers, she reported seeing one writing with his left hand at a desk. He tries to write something with his left hand, which apparently contains an order, as an elderly lady who is at his side leaves the room hurriedly. A young man of about 35 years of age unfastened the collar of the sick man and gives him some water to drink. Mrs. Zerold saw two teenage girls by the sick man's side, as well as two men who helped the patient out of the room. This remarkable description exactly matched an actual incident that occurred shortly before the writer of the note Mrs. Zerold was holding. He was a medical doctor who suddenly had a stroke. Pagenstecker tried a similar experiment by handing Mrs. Zerold a piece of string. Unknown to her, the string was originally attached to some dog tags worn by a German soldier who had given them to Pagenstecker. Mrs. Zerold described an unnerving scene. "It is intensely cold and the day is foggy. I am on a battlefield. It smells of gunpowder. In front of me, a tall man standing with a big gray overcoat on, which reaches to his feet. Behind him, I see three other men standing likewise. They talk German, or better said, they shout. In front of them and lying on the snow behind an earthwork, I see lines of soldiers keeping up a continuous rifle fire. Some men plainly to be seen, one consisting of about 5 to 6 men, and another one about 12 to 15 men. Quite of a sudden, I see coming through the air and moving with great rapidity a big red ball of fire, which drops just in the midst of the 15 men, tearing them to pieces." This response was a vivid reenactment in the life of Sergeant Senger, who had given the string to Pagenstecker. Senger described the incidents as the first great impression I received of the war. Do Pagenstecker's experiments tell us about psychometry? W.G. Roll, project director of the Psychical Research Foundation, made a critical reanalysis of Pagenstecker's work and found that some basic principles did seem to be operating during the experiments. He found that when a past occurrence is described, it usually was precipitated in the physical vicinity of the token object. Roll also found that he calls the law of primary events. The law states, as Roll enunciates it, that all things being equal, the first events in the history of an object are more likely to be cognized by ESP than others. Roll found this to be true in Mrs. Zerold's impressions. He also found a recency effect and a vividness effect, which simply means that recent occurrences and vivid occurrences related to the object are also more frequently cognized than trivial or past events. Where does all this lead us? Probably the most important implication is the actual object seems to be a generator of impressions. Some argue that psychometric objects are only crutches to help the psychic tune in on its owner and tap his mind by telepathy. Bogenstecker's data seems to argue against that theory, since the various associations picked up during psychometry seem linked to the object itself, not to its owner or handler. The other pioneer in the study of psychometry was Eugene Osti, who had the good fortune of working with several gifted subjects. One of these was Madame Morel, and experiments with her were recorded in Osti's supernormal faculties in man. On one occasion, Morel was asked to track a missing person. Osti had been contacted by a friend of an old man who had disappeared 2 weeks before. No name of the missing subject was given at that time, to determine if, by psychic means, he could be traced. Osti thought the experiment interesting and procured a scarf from the missing man's wardrobe. Madame Morel, while under hypnosis, was given the scarf, and after describing various visions, seemed to focus in on the target. "I see a man lying at full length. His eyes are closed as if sleeping, but he does not breathe. He is dead. He is not in bed but on the ground. The ground is damp, very damp, flat ground, uncultivated. There is water not far off, a large tree, some very big thing quite near, something very bushy, a wood." Osti instructed Madame Morel to trace the activities of the dead man during the fateful day, and she described in detail his walk from a country house along a path and his collapse. Then Madame Morel seemed to see the exact position of the body. "I see the body. It is lying on wet ground. He is bald, has a long nose, a little white hair above his ears and at the back of his head, wearing a long coat, soft shirt, hands closed. I see one finger which has been hurt, very old and wrinkled, pendant lips, forehead much furrowed, very high and open. He is lying on his right side, one leg bent under him." Aided by the clues given by Madame Morel, a search team found the body of Etienne Larosle, exactly as described by the psychic through her psychometric ability. If psychometry can fathom the past and describe the present, it is not hard to believe that it can also divine the future. Osti demonstrated this with another of his sensitives, Milda Burley. During one experiment, she spontaneously told Osti that he would be in a severe accident but would not be hurt. She saw another man bleeding on the ground. A few months later, Osti was driving his car when he collided with a baker's cart. The psychic vision was enacted in detail. Another instance of prediction made during a psychometric session comes from the records of another French psychic, Laplace. On holding a letter by the famous entomologist and amateur psychic Dr. Robert Tilliard, it was predicted that he would die in a car or rail crash. 9 years later, Tilliard did die in a car accident in Australia. That psychometry can lead psychics to predicting future events is no better illustrated than in an experiment made with the fabulous French sensitive Pascal Fortuny. Fortuny had originally disdained anything psychic. He was a much respected man of letters who discovered his psychometric abilities quite by accident when once, to make fun of what he considered a psychic sham, he grabbed a token object from a lady at a public meeting and began to give his impressions about its owner. All the while he mimicked those psychics he had seen. Well pleased with his rather sarcastic act, Fortuny was shocked to discover that everything he had said was correct. This incident began a long career as one of France's most tested as well as famous psychics. By touching an object, Fortuny would not only be able to give impressions about its owner, but even mimic the owner's speech and movements to an astounding degree. But if Professor Denton's research shows us that psychometric ESP lays bare knowledge of ancient things, Fortuny's ability showed how it could dip into the future as well. The experiment next related took place at the rooms of the Institut of Metapsychique International Paris on the 21st of April, 1926. And was carried out by Mr. Humboldt, a well-known political figure, Madame Camille Flammarion, wife of the celebrated astronomer, and Dr. Eugene Osti. Taking Fortuny to a lecture hall of 150 chairs set up for a lecture to be held an hour and a half later, the experimenters randomly selected a seat in the hall. Allowing no one to enter, Asti and his secretary alone instructed Fortuny to sit in the marked chair, psychometrize it, and report on who would sit there during the forthcoming lecture. A shorthand account of all he said was recorded by a secretary. Afterwards, Fortuny returned to Asti's upstairs office to be supervised by Madame Flammarion so that his whereabouts could be accounted for while the people were seated for the lecture. An hour later, the lecture hall was opened, and after a half hour more than 400 people had filled the hall. None of the 6 people who knew the target chair mingled with the audience until they had all been seated. An announcement was then made by Asti of the experiment planned. A young woman, Madame M., found herself occupying the center of attention, having inadvertently stumbled into the target chair. Item by item, she verified what Fortuny had said about her earlier. Fortuny had first stated that the occupants' plans for a summer vacation had been cancelled twice. Madame M. admitted that she had opted for 2 summer holidays, but she had cancelled both projects. Fortuny's next impressions were curious. Before everything, take care of your graves. This impression seemed to hit at a recent action by Madame M. The lady's mother had died 2 years prior, but it had been only 8 days before that the subject had first visited the gravesite. Fortuny next stated, "Leon has given me the chemist, I do not know why, and then take care of your liver." The first of these impressions held no meaning for Madame M, but the second most assuredly did, since she was currently under treatment for liver trouble. Fortuny next spoke about a belt that hurt her, and Madame M admitted wearing an elastic belt which was irritating her skin. If these brief but accurate impressions were not enough, Fortuny then recited an extremely alarming and vivid scene. "What a disturbance! You've been almost thrown to the ground morally. You've been trampled on and dragged in the dust. You've been done very well to get up yourself. The capital letter M, if you could recover all your poise, you could live your life without emotion." It would appear that Fortuny was speaking more figuratively than literally, and the entire impression fit a recent and unpleasant episode in Madame M's life. A business partner whose name did begin with the letter M had viciously slandered her. Madame M had thought about leaving her business to retreat, but instead had defended herself while regained her poise. After these remarks, Fortuny harked back to the subject's medical states as he had done earlier when commenting on the condition of her liver. "Pay no attention to a return of the affection of your ears, throat, and nose. Your neuralgia arises only from that." Madame M had suffered from neuralgia for years, but only a few days prior, a doctor had told her that the condition arose from a condition affecting her ears, nose, and throat. Fortuny's reading continued on with several other impressions, all correct. Actually, one comment, the mention of Leon, was incorrect or could not be isolated by the subject, but what of Madame M herself? How had she come to attend the lecture in the first place? Madame M told Asti that both he and the psychic had been unknown to her by name until only recently, when she had read a report on Fortuny. However, on the day in question, she didn't know of the lecture until she had been advised of it by a friend at lunch. She had planned on going but felt ill, yet became obsessed with the idea of attending the lecture. Finally, 10 minutes before the lecture hall's door opened, she stepped into the waiting crowd and was jostled about during the rush for seats when the hall opened. She grabbed their first chair within reach, which happened to be the marked one. Although it is clear that the experiment could not have been rigged, there is some evidence that even though they had never met, the chair test had put Fortuny and Madame M in some sort of telepathic rapport. Madame M reported how on deciding not to attend the lecture when she fell ill, she had become obsessed with the thought of missing the talk. Nonetheless, as she began her trek towards the institute, her illness vanished. All of this would imply that Madame M somehow unconsciously was aware that she was meant for the test. Chair tests, as they have become popularly known, are a psychic specialty of a modern Dutch psychic, Gerard Croiset. After these chair tests are selected for meetings several days or weeks in the future, in his test, though, an added determinant is made. The audience must randomly select their seats by a raffle so that no charge of collusion could be made, or that somehow Croiset directed just the right person somehow psychically to sit in the designated seat. Croiset, however, usually does not actually sit in the chosen chair to psychometrize it, but merely points it out in a seating plan. However, he is also a gifted psychometrist, and as such will be formally introduced later. After years of working with various psychometrists, Osti came to set of definite, at least to his mind, conclusions about the phenomenon and especially about the role of the token object. 1. To make contact with a person, an inductor helps make initial contact. Afterwards, the object is no longer required. 2. Any person who has touched the inductor is accessible to the psychic via ESP. 3. Persons associated with anyone who has handled the token object can also be read. 4. Psychometrist is able to get impressions about any of these persons independently of the token object. 5. Once a contact is made by means of the object, the inductor may even be destroyed without affecting the psychic's ability. 6. The past, present, or future of these persons is accessible to the psychic. 7. The physical or chemical makeup of the object is irrelevant. 8. The level and amount of data received about the target persons are not contingent on the length of contact with the object. 9. The time elapsed since contact with the object is irrelevant. 10. If different inductors are in mutual contact, this does not confuse the psychic's ability to gain impressions from them. 11. Errors occurring in psychometric sessions will often be reported during subsequent sessions. It is fairly obvious that Osti's conclusions point in a different direction than Poggenstecker's. Osti's research indicates that the psychometric object does little more than direct the psychic ESP to a specific event, clairvoyantly, or person, clairvoyantly or telepathically, and is only a catalyst, not a focal point of the ESP. Poggenstecker's data would lead one to believe that the psychics were picking up events directly from the object itself. One attempt to disprove the telepath theory of psychometry was made in experiments with the great Polish clairvoyant Stefan Oswicki, who was to demonstrate his abilities to an international conference on psychical research in Warsaw held in 1923. As a test, Eric Dingwall, research officer of the Society for Psychical Research, prepared a picture of a bottle in a frame, dated it August 22, 1923, wrote a sentence on the back of the picture, and sealed it in 3 separate envelopes within each other. This packet was sent to Warsaw. Dingwall remained in England to offset the theory that Oswicki was telepathically tapping his mind. Oswicki was given the object and concentrated on impressions received from the contents. He was able to draw the bottle accurately, read the date, but not the month, and divine that there was writing on the drawing, but not what it said. This experiment is impressive, but since we now have considerable evidence of long-distance ESP, the test does not argue against telepathy. The fact that drawings can be telepathically transmitted over great distances was demonstrated by René Warquelier in France, who, in conjunction with Gardner Murphy in the United States, conducted several successful transatlantic ESP picture drawing experiments. Just as in the past, there are great psychometrists with us today. Perhaps the most widely known is Gerard Croiset, a Dutch psychic whose abilities range from psychometry to prognostication to healing. Croiset's main investigator has been Professor W.H.C. Tenhoff. Tenhoff is a psychologist who, until his recent retirement, headed a division of parapsychology at the University of Utrecht, one of those rare universities where parapsychology is a recognized independent academic subject. During one casual test, Croiset was handed a wallet by a stranger. He began his reading almost immediately. I see the image of a man of slightly Jewish appearance. He has a pronounced nose and behaves in an excited way. Does this man keep money for somebody? Was this man in the service of the Germans? I see German officers around him, but they are not soldiers. They are administrative officers. I get the impression of lots of money. This money belongs to Dutchmen. It was stolen by Germans. Later, Croiset added that the wallet's owner was a double agent during the war. The wallet belonged to a friend of Tenhoff's guest, who verified the accuracy of Croiset's impressions. Like Madame Morel, Croiset has also been involved in tracking missing persons. In fact, he seems to be especially motivated by such cases, particularly when children are concerned. Several such cases are cited in the book Croiset the Clairvoyant by the American journalist Jack Harrison Pollock. In one instance, Croiset was able to receive accurate impressions about a missing boy in California. On July 13, 1960, Bruce Keenan, age 7, disappeared while on a hiking trip near Los Angeles. The boy's mother contacted Pollock in the hopes that Croiset might be able to aid in the search. A week later, Pollock's records, a photograph was given to Croisset as an inductor. He ran his fingers over the picture and dolefully told Pollock, "I'm sorry, Jack, I cannot help you. I see this boy has died in the mountains, and it will be very hard to find his body." The prediction was accurate. The body was never found. A more conventional case of psychometry with Croisset was carried out by a BBC filming crew at the suggestion of Mr. Brian Branston. The experiment was impromptu in that Croisset, while knowing that he was to be the subject of an interview and documentary, did not know that Branston had an on-the-spot psychometry experiment up his sleeve. Croisset was just handed an envelope containing a rather time-worn letter which he was not allowed to read. This was handed to him by another BBC member who did not know the contents either. The following are Croisset's impressions translated from the Dutch. "I have an idea, a document about a former century. It deals with question. This is handwriting authentic?" Here Croisset was told that the presenters did not know the letter's contents. "This is long ago. This is from a former century, from history. Is it a man who has been on a ship, a sailor, a high-ranked officer, a sort of marine? He drowned with a marine ship. I see he has a job on a marine ship. A ship is sinking and then he disappears. He disappears with the ship between America and England, Atlantic Ocean, 1866 or 1869. I'm sorry. 1866 or 1868. This man has been a captain of a ship. The ship is broken into two parts in the middle. That's all. Thank you. After this reading, those present were made aware of the letter's history. The letter itself was nothing more than a social request for church seats, but it was written by John Franklin, a British naval officer who had attempted to traverse the Atlantic Ocean in 1845 to search for the Northwest Passage, which was thought to connect the Great Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Franklin disappeared on the voyage along with his crew and ship. Years later, it was discovered that his ship had been trapped in ice along with a companion vessel, and that Franklin and most of his crew had died of exposure. No survivors, if there were any, were ever found. In this light, we can see that practically all of Croisset's impressions were correct. The historical nature of the letter, that the writer was a high-ranking naval officer and captain of a ship which sank between America and England. The only incorrect comments were Croisset's attempts to date the incident, though he did ultimately hit at the right century. Unfortunately, this BBC film was never shown, but the information contained in it was later made public by Brian Branston in his own book, Beyond Belief. As was previously stated, Croisset's chief investigator has been W.H.C. Tenhoff, whose major contribution to the study of psychometry has not been on how it works, but in fact, what caused it not to work. In other words, what are the sources of errors which so often creep into psychometric readings? First, Tenhoff believes are suggestions from the object itself. For example, a knife might evoke scenes of a stabbing, which may be wholly a fantasy suggested by common associations with the object. Secondly, he believes that telepathy from the object's owner may get the psychic off the track. Preconceived ideas of the type of information he would like to receive may be psychically received and quoted back to the sitter, regardless of its accuracy. Third, since most psychometrists report that they try to capture psychically induced mental images, which they then interpret, they may in fact misinterpret these images or even confuse non-psychic with psychic images. By this time, the reader may have thought that psychometry is particularly prevalent among European psychics. The United States has had and has now its share of psychometrists as well. Mrs. Eileen Garrett had one of the most revered names in parapsychology. A psychic from childhood, Mrs. Garrett could never appraise her own abilities, which gradually turned into trance mediumship. Although the information she proffered was undoubtedly psychically acquired, did it come from the dead or telepathically from the people sitting for the experiment, which her own subconscious passed off as coming from the dead? These questions led Mrs. Garrett to many parapsychologists, psychologists, and other scientists, as she eventually founded her own organization, the Parapsychology Foundation, and in 1951, with the aid of the wealthy Congresswoman Frances Bolton, to promote further research and education in parapsychology. Although by the end of her life, she died in 1970, she was governed more by her administrative responsibilities than by her psychic capabilities. She remained a gifted sensitive. Shortly before her death, Mrs. Garrett was the subject of an extremely evidential case of psychometry while in trance, investigated by Lawrence Leshon, a psychologist who has spent much time studying and writing on parapsychology. The case was published in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research in January 1968 as The Vanished Man, a psychometry experiment with Mrs. Eileen Garrett. The vanished man was Dr. B, who on February 24, 1966, checked out of his hotel room in a Midwestern city and simply disappeared. His worried wife contacted Dr. LaShawn, who called Mrs. Garrett for assistance. An appointment was made. Nothing more was said. Mrs. Garrett went into a trance, and her control, Uvani, manifested and correctly diagnosed the problem. A man has vanished, disappeared. His wife is very upset and seeks some idea of his whereabouts. LaShawn gave Mrs. Garrett a cutting from one of Dr. B's shirts. Uvani correctly stated that the man had planned to go to Mexico. This fact was not verified until several days later. Uvani also associated the trip with one to California, which ultimately proved correct. 10 days later, a second sitting was held. During this experiment, Mrs. Garrett remained in a waking state and was given a sealed box which contained, unknown to Mrs. Garrett, one of Dr. B's favorite pens. The following veridical impressions were given. The man is in his middle 40s. Dr. B was in fact 42. When between ages of 13 and 15, the man had lost a member of his family, probably his father. When Dr. B was 14, his father deserted his family. The man is 5'10", actually 5'9". Finally, Mrs. Garrett saw the man in La Jolla. That same day, Dr. B contacted his wife from La Jolla, where he had been living except for a sojourn to Mexico. I could spend hours going over past experiments with psychometry. This is some small sampling of some of the amazing different tests that have been done in the past. I do believe that psychometry is a complex process, and it seems to not only depend on the inductor of the object, but the very personality which has impressed it. And it seems to be a mixture of both clairvoyance and telepathy. Dr. G.N.M. Terrell, in his excellent book Science and Psychical Phenomenon, states that object reading would appear to be evidence, therefore, for the faculty of telesthesia, telepathy initiated by the psychic, not the agent. But there is one more lesson to be drawn from it, namely that a close connection must exist between telepathy and clairvoyance. Somehow the presence of the physical object assists the operation of this telesthesic form of telepathy. But the relation between a physical object and the extrasensory faculty is just the puzzle set by clairvoyance. The main thing to understand, if we look at physics, as Einstein called it, spooky action at a distance, two objects can be linked together. And once they're linked together, it doesn't matter how far apart they are linked together. So oftentimes, the things that you have in your life are linked to you. And what's happening when you touch an object, you're linking to the person, and you're creating that link. When two elements are linked like that, they're linked for all time, and you can access impressions from it. Many of you have heard about psychics requiring a piece of cloth or something to find that child that's lost. I am telling you, you're more psychic than you were a year ago, and much more psychic than you were 5 years ago, because the natural increase of fourth density light that you may not even be aware of. So what I want you to do is do a short little meditation with me. This doesn't take very long. What I want you to do is find an object. It may be helpful if you don't have an impression to form around this object, meaning that you know a lot about it. Maybe it's just a random object that you have, but it can be any object. You can mark it here, and you can come back to this episode anytime and use this meditation to learn more, to create a psychic link with the person that was associated with the object or the event that's associated. But the bottom line is you are linked to this object. Find the object and have it with you. Just close your eyes for a few moments. Try to relax. Take a deep and slow breath. It helps your heart to be in coherence with your mind as you do this. Breathing in through your nose. Hold it, and then breathe out slowly. Let go of any tensions that you will have in your body. Remove any thoughts about the outside world. Relax your shoulders. Rest your hands comfortably. Relax the muscles in your face. Feel the energies of the earth coming up through your feet, flowing through your body up to the top of your head. And feel light from the universe coming down through the top of your head, flowing down through your body, down through your feet. As you feel this movement of light in your body, I want you to feel a third light enter in through your heart. This is the fourth density light. Allow this light to fill up your entire body, to move through your arms into your hands, and now I want you to feel it growing for a few moments. Now, pick up this object. You can open your eyes and simply look at the object. Notice any small details that come to mind. Flip it over. Now close your eyes and try to see the object in your mind. Let the light flow through the object. Feel yourself linking to this object, the object becoming a part of you. Now, as you sit there, I want you to pull up any mental images that come up as you hold this object. What images come to mind? Expand your senses. Do you smell anything? Can you hear any noises? Does this feel as if it's in the past, the present, or the future? While this information is fresh within your mind, I want you to write down any impressions that you might have. Test this ability out. Have friends or family members give you items. They have knowledge of its history, and have them test whether or not you can acquire any information about this object in the past or future. Document this information. Continue to monitor the feelings that you get as you pick up objects. Not just relax and bring up any more information. Note any new information that comes to you. Very good. Now, please report back if you find any information from this process. It is very powerful. You will acquire information and link yourself to people, places, and things that you never knew that you could. This is the beginning steps of your psychic abilities being expanded. This is something that I have found to be of great assistance to me. It is a great joy for me to look through old books because I get impressions of the former owners all the time. Everything around you carries a psychic link, and the more and more you come into a resonance with this ability, you're going to find and learn more things with everything around you. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com, and welcome to The Reality Revolution.